I'm Ed Adams, and you're listening to the AFCA Podcast. Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of the AFCA Podcast. And on today's show, we discuss film editing with the amazing Terilyn Shropshire. I'll splice you in after the break. The AFCA Podcast is sponsored by Morgan Stanley Global Sports and Entertainment. When watching a film, it's easy to pick out the craft of the actors or the vision of the director. We can even deep dive into the lens of the cinematographer and the music composer. But actually, when we look at a film, the one person we see and don't see is the film editor. As a journalist, I know firsthand how important it is to have an editor put their eyes on my work and fine-tune it. And for film, this is no different. Terilyn Shropshire is an award-winning film editor with over 20 years' experience working in both film and television. She's worked on films including Eve's Bayou, Love and Basketball, Sparkle, Beyond the Lights, and The Secret Lives of Bees. She's even worked on television series including Quantico, and most recently the award-winning Netflix series When They See Us.
I lied on you too.
Yeah. Me too. I'm sorry, man.
They made us lie. Right? Why are you doing us like this?
What other way they ever do us?
Recently, I spoke via Skype to Terilyn to talk about her role as a film editor, her projects, and her movie-making process. Terilyn, welcome to the AFCA Podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So one of the things that I wanted to know first is that you have a very inspiring Twitter feed. And yeah, and you said you had this quote, this mantra that you had in your description, and you said, "I dwell in the what if." And I wanted to know, can you explain that, and how does that shape what you do as a film editor?
I love that thought because so much of what you do as an editor is constantly asking the question, what if? What if we try this? What if we move something from one place to another? What if we completely throw the order of things up in the air? And as an editor, often what you're doing is not about people will talk about, oh, there's problems, but your job is really to find the solutions. And in trying to find solutions and trying to find the film itself, that question's asked all the time. In fact, I have a sign in my editing room framed. Literally, when you walk in, you see the two words, what if?
Oh,
and
wow.
You really have to, as an editor, constantly be looking to discover, to try to keep your mind open to new pathways, new ideas, other people's perspective. And I think sometimes what happens when you get in that room is you get very, sometimes you get stuck, and sometimes you get narrowed into a particular thought or a way that you think it should be. And sometimes you have to, no matter where you are in your career, how long you've done this, whether you're new to editing, whether you've been doing it for, a very long time like I have, you have to continue to kind of free your mind and be willing to, even if it's not the right answer, sometimes it leads you to something else, but you have to be always open to that question. What if we try this? What if we try that? And And it's not always as easy to remember that as when you're working on something.
Huh, okay. When I think of what if, I do think about infinite possibilities, but I have to admit that I kind of live in my own universe of what that could be. So I probably limit myself far more than you do. But one of the things I read, I'm sorry.
Things are infinite.
But one of the things I did read is that you studied journalism in school. So how did you go from being a journalist or becoming a journalist to becoming a film editor?
Well, I always liked writing. I always enjoyed, reading and receiving information. And I think that journalism became something that I majored in because I really did enjoy English and writing and when I was young, going through high school. But what I found about journalism was so much about it is, of course, getting it down on the page, right? But then there's so much editing to be done, even as a journalist, when you're editing your work or you're editing someone else's work, or you're looking at even something with respect to broadcasting. You're always kind of refining. And I found that process to be the most instinctive to me. I found it to be something that just felt organic. It was not always easy to. I found myself, even as I was writing, it was often difficult to kind of finish something before you wanted to start refining it. And I think that the trick is to try to get something written all the way through, or even edit it all the way through, and then go back and refine. And so I think journalism kind of led me to editing in many ways when I finally did start to really study film. And I double majored. I went to USC. I went in as a freshman as a journalism major, and specifically kind of geared towards broadcast journalism. And then when I got accepted in the film department, I just kept both majors. And it took me a year longer to graduate, but I was really grateful to have both, because I feel like, in some ways, the journalism, and it's so similar, writing and editing. It's a very similar type of form, and I feel that it did help me a lot in my filmmaking process.
Huh. I was curious about this because I would think as a journalist myself, you're seeking truths, right? You're trying to find the truth to the story, the truth of what you're trying to tell, or storytelling. And I would imagine as an editor, you're doing a very similar process, right? You're taking all of this footage or a script or something, all this footage from a director, and finding the truth throughout all of that stuff.
It's very, very true. I mean, even within doing something non-documentary, doing a narrative or any type of storytelling, you're trying to hold the truth of your characters and what their goals are, what their struggles are, what the conflicts are. And you're always trying to stay grounded in that, even if it's a film that's a fantasy. Mm-hmm. Fantasy has its own language, and comedy has its own language, and there is a truth to those characters. Whatever they're doing, they have a goal, and they, when you're watching something, that they have a journey that they're on, and you have to kind of, in some ways, as a journalist, try to find that, the center of that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So to piggyback on that, is that for you, where does your vision begin? Does it begin with the footage or the script?
It begins with the script,
yeah.
Always the script. And it is my roadmap. And it is ultimately, when I go in to interview or talk with directors, it's interesting because I think that any craftsperson would say that, whether you're a production designer or a DP or even someone who's doing sound, or it is what kind of helps you inform and decide what this journey is that you're about to take with this person. And it is the conversation that you have in the room. I mean, I like to think that by the time I get into an interview with a director who I haven't worked with before, everybody that's walking through that door is skilled. Everybody that's walking through that door obviously got that far because they can cut, because they can edit. So in some ways, what will distinguish me or my relationship with that filmmaker from anyone else that walks through the door. And part of it is really kind of talking about the script and understanding the story and asking questions and hopefully being able to decide whether you guys can spend 12, 13, 14, 15 plus 16 hours a day on any given day really working story and talking story.
With the script and even with the footage that you get on a daily basis, the one thing I've always been fascinated about for editors is there's so much footage. How do you track what's good, what's not, what I may want to use, what, like how do you archive all of those dailies and all of this stuff to say, okay, I think I got what I need. I don't think it needs to be reshot. Like, what is your process for handling your dailies and working through all the content that you do get?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it is a lot of footage, and it's become even more because of the whole digital aspect. And we used to, like back in the day, we used to just get selected takes or circle takes, and now everything comes to us. So it is a daunting process. And what I really try to do is the first time I watch dailies, I try not to, unless I'm under some incredible time crunch, I really try not to make any notes. I try to pretend I'm in a dark theater with my popcorn and my drink, and I start watching the dailies as an audience member and getting a sense of what I feel and what kind of responses am I initially getting from watching things. I get somewhat of a roadmap when I'm watching. If the director has made some kind of comments, often the script supervisors might write it down. I keep aware of that, but I try to keep myself as kind of, in a sense, distanced, but aware of maybe what was liked on set, because there's a lot of things going on at set, and sometimes you can miss things even when you're there. So I go through everything, and I watch everything, and it does take time. And often, if it's a multi-camera situation, I've had my assistants kind of group things so that I can actually watch a number of different cameras at once of the same take. So that helps me get through it. So I go through that process first, and I really get a sense of, what's there. And then I go back through, and as I'm watching it the first time, I start to get a sense of, what moment caught me, or what look, or what expression, or what performance affected me as an audience. And then I go back through, and I start to kind of narrow. I'll start building selects. I'll start taking all the takes and then like literally lining them up and then pulling out things that I remember liking. And from there, I start to build a scene. And it doesn't mean that those are the takes that ultimately stay, but they're kind of my first instinct takes. And from there, it just evolves. You go over and you start to build a scene, and then you start to think, well, maybe that other take might work better here. And then you continue to just keep building that way until you have built a foundation of a cut for a director to come in, and then that could all change. Or there may be things that I did that they want to make a slight adjustment to. The film continues to evolve until it gets to the theater, I have to say. Obviously, there's a certain point where you lock everything, and because people, that's the thing about filmmaking, is there's different perspectives, and often something that I saw on a take, the director might have had a different intention, and so then we'll go back in and take a look at those takes, and so you're constantly readjusting and refining. And sometimes they're just incremental things, and sometimes they're big things. But that's part of the editing process, is that you're constantly re-editing and refining and narrowing and centering and finding that right performance for that character, finding that character arc. Often once the director gets in and we kind of are in the ballpark of what we like, we'll go through and really do a performance pass on each character and really make sure that we're kind of following, again, what their journey is, what their intention is, what their character arc is through the process. And that's what I love about it, is that you're constantly rediscovering, aspects of the film because you have all the pieces.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So you did mention a lot of what we were just talking about was collaboration, and which leads me to my next question, because I would imagine as an editor, a lot of it is kind of isolated. You know, you're kind of envisioning things as they're being brought to you so that you can kind of figure out what pieces you think are important to build out your scenes. But there's also that collaborative part from beginning to end with the directors and like the DPs and all these other people. So I'm curious, can you talk to me about a little bit more about the collaboration process? And specifically, one of the things that when I think about, like you've worked with Ava a couple of times, and I thought that, you know, with an amazing job on When They See Us, because it just gives me my moments, and there's scenes in that still just jar me. I remember you worked on the first episode, and that's the one that everyone says, I had to walk away. I had to walk away. It was too emotional. I had to do this. And I wanted to just kind of briefly, can you talk to me about the project itself, the collaboration between you and Ava, and that process where you're dealing with something that is not only important cinematically, but also important historically?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that project will always, I mean, I always say I love all my children, right? Because in some ways they all are, they become that to you. This one was, it was an indescribable journey. I mean, from the moment that Ava reached out and basically asked me what I was up to the point of, I was actually out of the country when it came out on Netflix, and to get and see the worldwide response it got was absolutely sobering. I mean, during the journey, Ava was in New York and she was shooting, and she was doing them all, and with an amazing, amazing crew. And the way that they were shooting was in such a way that they were primarily shooting part one, but they were also shooting elements of the other parts as well. So as things were coming in, I was getting the dailies for part one, and then the other editor, Spencer, who's her, what I call her OG, the guy who's been with her from the beginning. He's such a great, talented, just person, and Michelle Tesoro. As their stuff started coming in, if they weren't in yet, I was just kind of putting my eyes on it just to be able to kind of give Ava some feedback, as was Spencer. I mean, he was, he came on probably, I don't remember how many weeks he came on to kind of start to after I got there. But, we were just always kind of, you never knew what you were going to be getting in. Obviously there was a schedule, but I mean, so there'd be part one, and then some of part two might come in if it was a similar location. And what was so remarkable about what I was seeing was kind of, you think that you know the story. You think you know the story. And then you see these characters coming to life and these people coming to life. And the actors that were playing them, these young men, were blowing me away every day. And so basically it was kind of one of those things where the material would come in. After I looked at the dailies, I would send Ava a note, and, just give her my thoughts on what I was seeing. And then I would start cutting. And I don't remember that she really saw anything or needed to see anything before she finally got in. I'm trying to remember whether I sent her anything or not. Generally, I think she was just it was such an incredible schedule to try to do all four. And I'm still blown away how she, I'm not surprised, but still, she never ceases to amaze me, that woman. So anyway, so that's what we did. So we started building one, and then Spencer came in to do two, and he was supposed to do four, and then Michelle came in to do three. And we were all at one point working kind of at the same time, even though we knew that one was the first off the blocks as far as mixing and that kind of thing. It was also one proved to be the most challenging because of the need to be able to really set the stakes and introduce everyone to the boys, and be able to introduce the families, and it literally kind of sets off everything else that's in motion, and So it was definitely challenging, and it was great to be in a situation to be around so many other smart, collaborative editors who you could use for perspective, who could take a look at things that you were working on. I think what was great about the process, even for Ava, was to have the three of us being able to, look at material and put forth our ideas and what ifs. From all three of us, and that was something that I really enjoyed in the process, was having that teamwork.
Oh, that's awesome. Piggybacking on something about that is tension. A lot of what people think is when tension happens, yeah, it's kind of written in the script and the director is capturing those moments from the actors. But the actual tension that we see is actually the tension that you create. So I was curious because there's two types of tension that I look at. There's that dramatic tension, like what we saw in When They See Us. And then there's the tension between two people romantically or sexually. And one of my favorite movies that you did, Love and Basketball. So when you look at tension, like when you're working on things, is there a technique or something that you're looking for when you're creating dramatic tension as opposed to like romantic or sexual tension?
I think it has to do, it's, I don't, in terms of like having hard and fast rules, I feel that often the material kind of helps me in that respect. I think that part of being an editor is not just knowing when to cut, but knowing when not to cut, when to hold on a moment and how long to hold on a moment to kind of create that. If everybody's done their job right, it's there. It's just a matter of knowing and sensing those rhythms. And when, again, you always have to bring yourself back to being an audience member. And I always say my other mantra is forget what you know, especially in the editing room, because sometimes you can get very almost too used to what you're working on and you forget that you're an audience member. And I think that when it comes to tension, whether it's that sexual tension of, first love and you're always also kind of pulling from your own experience with something like that and feeling what that was, or, anytime you've been in a situation where there is some kind of magnetic connection between some two people, or the opposite, a disconnect. And I think that often your actors can do beautiful jobs of giving you emotions, and you just have to know when to hold them and how long to hold them, and when to let go. I remember when Casey was directing Eve's Bayou, and I remember she was working with Journey, and I think that they had this kind of relationship where Casey could walk up to Journey and if Journey was about to cry or she would be able to kind of tell her just to hold the tear, try to hold it, or okay, let the tear fall, but in some way, kind of like that in editing, it's like, do you let the tear fall? Do you just hold it? How long do you hold it? And sometimes you just have to, as a storyteller, it comes with experience, and it comes with knowing, and I guess in a sense, knowing your audience to some degree, since you are an audience person as well, if that makes any sense.
It does.
You don't want to ever feel like you're being manipulated. It's like suddenly you want to be sitting in a theater and feeling that, or feeling happy or sad or tense, and not necessarily know how you got there. And my job, hopefully, is to be a little bit of a silent puppet master, so to speak. You don't really see me working, but hopefully it emotionally makes you feel tense or makes you feel those things.
It's seamless. It's seamless. I love that invisible puppet master. I love that one. Have you ever felt like you've over edited a piece? Or when do you know, like, okay, I'm done with this. I've done everything I can do?
Wow. Over edited. God, I hope not. I don't, that's up for other people to decide. But I do feel that there is a time as you approach the end of a project where I find myself, my shoulders start to go up a little bit. I start to become a little bit protective and tense about, again, maybe overcooking the soup or the meal, or where you feel like you have it right in the pocket. And in some ways, I feel towards the end of a project is the most dangerous because, again, you're so familiar with everything. You're so familiar with the story. And, there's a danger in trying to do too much or explain too much or, adjust something that's working, because it feels like, okay, this is the end. And so I find myself as an editor being very, very careful. Because I think towards the end of the film, if you've done everything right, all you should be doing is diamond cutting. You should just be kind of, making the facets just right and polishing and shining, and not trying to overthink it too much. And I think that that's why it's, I find myself being very careful and cautious, and just making sure that you don't ever want to drop the ball.
Mm-hmm.
You want to kind of always stay vigilant, always. And that doesn't mean that you don't continue to explore and you continue to try to make things better. But when they say better is the enemy of good, can be, I think that you just have to really be careful,
Okay.
I think, towards the end.
Okay. Final question. I was kind of curious about this. When you first started out, there's always these lessons that you learn. And I was curious, in your profession, what is the one lesson that you learned early on that you still adhere to today and that you pass on to aspiring editors?
Well, other than, again, dwell on the what if, I would say that as an editor, I think you can take pride in your work, but you can never covet it because it is not yours to covet. I think you have to recognize that you're working in a collaborative art. You're working in a commercial art. There are many voices in the room. And I think you have to be able to keep yourself open to those voices, even if you don't necessarily always agree with what's being spoken. I feel that the film will rise to where it's supposed to be with your guidance as an editor and the guidance of the filmmakers, the directors. I think that's the thing is I think that sometimes young editors start to take things very personal because your work is personal. But you have to always remember that you're collaborating with people and they want to be heard just like you want to be heard. So I think that's one of the biggest advices that I kind of continue to try to give and to remind myself.
Terilyn, thank you so much for being a part of this interview.
Well, thank you for asking. It really has been a pleasure.
That was Terilyn Shropshire discussing the invisible art of film editing. Now, if you'd like to know more about film editing, I recommend Googling the Kuleshov effect. It's a fascinating experiment in film that took place in the early 1900s that shows the power and potential of film editing. And that's our show. Thanks again to Terilyn Shropshire for breaking down her craft with me. And did you know that APCA recently had their annual award show? Well, we did, and you can read all about it along with the photos from this year's event on our website and social media. So until next time, keep your head up.